Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are glad you're all joining us today. Hopefully, it's not too in the weeds and boring, but whether this is your first lease or your 50th, we think this session will give you something valuable you can take back to your business. We're going to deep dive into a topic that can seriously impact your bottom line, your lease's critical dates. Um, Most people know the big ones, rent start date, lease end date, but leases are full of other important dates and events that affect your responsibilities, your rights, and your money, and they're not always obvious. Um, Leases go through multiple drafts and revisions, and we've seen plenty that include confusing and even contradictory language around those dates. If you're not clear on what your lease actually says, or how those dates are calculated, you could end up paying rent too early, missing a renewal window, and losing out on free rent. So we're going to walk you through the most common critical dates, show real examples from leases, and explain what to look for. We will also show you different definitions that can completely change your rent schedule, escalation timeline, and lease expiration. So Heather is going to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Um, like Tara said, we're going to try not to get too in the weeds, but what we're going to show you is these critical dates, why they matter, and how you kind of have to investigate a little bit when you're dealing with them. And that does mean digging into and reading your lease a little bit, but in the end, you're going to understand your lease, you're going to understand your obligations, and you're going to understand the critical date and what it triggers. It's going to trigger your rent starting, deadline, when you are now bound by your lease, when your lease ends, and your renewal dates, all of those important dates that are going to trigger some obligation. Um, and then we're going to help you avoid surprises by knowing your lease. And once you get the hang of understanding the dates and reading through your lease and kind of determining, because you're going to have to jump to different clauses to determine what those dates are. Sometimes you're going to feel so much more comfortable in understanding any future leases that you get into. So you probably are familiar with some of these terms that are in your lease, your effective date, your lease commencement date, your rent commencement date, rent escalation or increase dates, your expiration date, and then lease year definitions. When we get into lease year definitions and we get into lease term, those are things you may not have paid attention to in the past. So we're going to go over those as well, and we're going to break down each of these for you and how they're worded differently in your leases and what to look for.
All right, the first one, effective date. This one can be pretty tricky. It is usually the date the lease is signed by all parties, but not always. It often appears at the top of the lease and can feel just like paperwork. In some leases, the straight date triggers financial or legal obligations, so you don't want to ignore it. It might not be the same as your lease or rent commencement date. You'll need to read all the terms to make sure, and you will want to make sure this date is filled out once it's fully executed. Oftentimes, it's entered, typed in, and then the lease isn't signed for a month later. So while it might say that's the effective date, it could be argued between the parties what the actual effective date is. So the next one, we're going to show an example of a standard effective date. So this one, obviously, it's typed in. It says it's the 12th of May. This is what it might look like. It's usually listed right at the top. And like I said, you're going to want to make sure this is filled in, especially if it was negotiated over email, red lines. It could be left blank, but the lease is dated at the end, or it might not have a date anywhere. So, effective date effectively means you're bound to the lease from this point. Unless there's there's sometimes an exception where you can get out if you can't get permits. But typically, this means you're bound to this agreement, even though none of the term has started yet. And Heather, you can talk about lease commencement date.
So before I get into lease commencement date, I want to go back to effective date and
Sorry.
explain how the effective date can be your lease commencement, and you can move on, Michelle, to lease commencement. I just want to reiterate that effective date being filled in because there are times where you go to look at what your lease commencement date is, and it will say lease commencement date is the effective date. And you have to go back to the top and see what that date is. And if it's not filled in, that can cause actually a domino effect on not having memorialized rents and other your expiration date and things like that. And we'll get into the term and how those commencement dates and rent commencement dates and expiration dates all fall into the term. But again, just wanted to circle back how the effective date can um, how it can affect all of the lease dates moving forward. So getting into lease commencement date, this is when your lease officially begins, not always when your rent starts, but when your lease will begin. And it can be tied to the delivery date. It can be tied to substantial completion of tenant improvements or when your build out starts. So this is also an important date and a date you want to keep an eye on, especially if it's caused by an event. So let's get into that next. So for the next slide, you'll see two examples. So the first example is a pretty straightforward lease commencement date. It is based on one event happening. So after the completion of landlord's work. And it does say that it's going to be memorialized in Exhibit B. So the problem I see a lot, Tara and I both see a lot when we get leases, is that Exhibit B is a blank form. So it's showing an example of what that certificate's going to look like. And then the tenant never gets it from the landlord. So you probably have a lot of those in your leases and haven't gotten that actually completed and sent to you by the landlord. It's always good to follow up and try to get that. It'll just be something where you have a solid date tied to this this clause that just kind of leaves it open-ended until that is completed. So once the landlord's work is complete, they're going to send you the certificate or commencement date memorandum that's going to have a hard date in there. And that's just one event. The second example is going over what we see a lot, which is the earlier to occur or whichever happens first. It can also say whichever happens later. But in this example, we're saying the earliest to occur. So the date that you open for business, the date that substantial completion is of the premises and the installation and fixtures are in. Also could be referred to as F&E, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Um, the issuance of certificate of occupancy. So you've got, or 150 days after the delivery. So you've got all these scenarios in here and what is the earlier to occur. A lot of times we'll see two. We'll see 150 days after the premises has been delivered to the tenant or when the tenant opens for business, whichever is earlier. So you may know your opening date was June 1st, 2024. But was that earlier of 150 days after delivery? You're going to want to do the math and figure that out. You're going to want to look at which happened first because that is going to be your commencement date. And as we get into term, as we get into rents, you'll see why that's important to make sure you have that memorialized.
The next is rent commencement date, which sometimes is synonymous with the lease commencement date, but oftentimes it's not, and it can trigger the term, or it might be the lease commencement date. So this is another very important thing to look at. If you're not writing a check right away, there might be an abatement, but the term might still be ticking. So this is something you're going to want to track. It can affect your expiration date, escalations, renewal deadlines. So looking at all these different dates, like Heather was saying, is so important. We're going to give a couple examples. And the first one here, the rent commencement date is whichever comes first. 180 days after commencement or the business opens, which is a lot like what Heather was just showing with the lease term. Sometimes There's just a distinction where the landlord wants to grant you some free rent, gives you time to do your build out, but wants you to pay triple nets, insurance, utilities. So that's sometimes why there's that distinction. Um, and so this is a good reminder to track this. If your build out gets delayed, the clock may still run and you could be forced to, you could force to pay rent before you're open. And this date is usually what ties your escalation date, which we're going to talk about in a minute. The first scenario, it's just really easy. And the second one is a little more in depth. Again, kind of like the lease commencement date, there's a lot of little triggering factors you have to know in order to determine that. And then again, this lease year comes up again. It's going to be something important that you're going to want to follow along with. Did I leave anything off, Heather, on rent commencement date?
No, I think that covers it.
No. Oh, do we have more? Sorry. Are there more scenarios? Yes, we do. Here's another one. This one, your rent starts 120 days after permits are issued, but not later than 200 days after commencement. So if you have some delays getting your permits, you could be opening soon. And then this one has an abatement that starts after the rent commencement date. So often when a customer will provide us with a date, they'll say we started paying rent this date, but that's not necessarily the rent commencement date because that abatement comes in starting on the rent commencement date. So that is also something to make sure you're paying special attention to. Next, we have
Rent escalation dates, which is your rent increase dates, which is why you need to know when your rent commences. Most of the time that's gonna be your trigger of, hopefully, you don't have anything confusing, which we're gonna go over in a minute. But your rent increase dates are gonna be dependent on if they're annual, they could be every 5 years, but you're also it's usually the anniversary of the rent commencement date, but that can be different depending on the lease, and we're going to get into that a little bit too. And we can go to our first example. So, as far as the rent commencement dates go and your term, you're going to make sure you're reading your term before you get into your figuring out your escalation dates. So, in this in this scenario, we've got a example of a term. So the period of time from the lease commencement date through the final day of 132nd full calendar month from the rent commencement date. So this is giving us, we know in this scenario that the term goes to the end of the month. So we know that the term isn't, if the rent starts on, January 15th, we know that it goes to the end of the 30th month of the prior month. So, or the 31st of December, that it's pulled out. So, you got to watch those full calendar months with the rent escalation dates. But in this scenario that we're looking at, if the rent were to say the rent commencement date was on the 15th, it's still not really telling you when those increases occur. Yes, the end of the term goes to the full calendar month, but of the 132nd month, but it isn't defining those increase dates. So that's something that in this language, you're going to need to go back and get clarification on. And Tara's going to get into some more scenarios with you next.
So in this scenario, like Heather was saying, there were 132 months of term plus a partial month. So if your rent started on the first day of the month, this chart is perfect. It's easy. But if your rent started on the 15th, you don't really know if the escalations are on the 15th annually. So it only shows 132 months of rent, but you really have 132 and a half. And if there's no definition of a lease year, you're kind of at your landlord's mercy to agree to a term. Obviously, it's easiest to just round it to the next and start on the first day of the month, but this could be a scenario where they want that extra 15 um, months in the beginning, 15 days in the beginning, and so your escalations are on the 15th through the whole term. The next scenario, um, this this one has a lease year. The other one had months. So this is a key definition starting on the first day of the month after the rent commencement date, but the term is 120 months. It may end mid-month. So if the rent and the term start mid-month, that could mean that the last lease year is short. I know this sounds very complicated and convoluted, but the term is in months, but the rent is in lease years, and the lease year goes to the end of a month. So if the term ends mid-month, but your rent line goes to the end of the month, it could really throw off when your anniversary dates are. And if it's unclear, it can be up to interpretation. You're going to want to understand and, reach out to your landlord to get the best scenario for you. And it's easiest to always do it on the first of the month, so you're not having prorated months every year. But it can affect your renewal options if it's unclear. You could be thinking that your term ends mid-month and your landlord thinks it ends at the end of the month, or vice versa. Um, Expiration date, Heather. You want to talk about
Yes.
that?
So expiration dates, they seem like they'll be pretty simple and straightforward, but they're not always. And it's often calculated on lease years. As you saw in that other definition for terms, it said the end of the calendar month or the last day of the calendar month. So that was helpful in knowing and determining what your expiration date is. So you want to pay attention to that lease language because misinterpreting this date can cost you some time on your exercising your renewal and being out of the space and time. So you want to make sure you're really reading that definition when it comes to the expiration date, going back and looking at some of the definitions for lease years. And we're going to give you a couple of examples next on expiration dates. So the first one is the last day of 128th month of the full calendar month. If the commencement month is not a full calendar month, or from and including if the commencement month is a full calendar month, the commencement month. So when you're reading this, think of your calendar and think of that first month, including a partial month, and then your year starts. So if it's January 15th, you're going to include that in your first calendar month. So include that as actually like February 1st is your start date because those 15 days are included at the top of the term. Um, and then it goes to the end of the 128th month. The expiration date in example 2 is just 120 months. Does not explain if it starts on the 15th or mid-month, if it goes to the end of the month. In this scenario, if you were starting your commencement date and the term was based from the commencement date to the expiration date, I would think because it doesn't specifically say to the end of the calendar month that it would end on the 14th. So making that a year. So that's where you really want to get some clarification from your landlord if it's not, doesn't explicitly say in the lease and explain if your expiration goes to the end of the month. Um, in the third example, 15 lease years following the rent commencement date. And that's a better written definition for you because now you can go look at what is a lease year. And we're going to get into that in a few minutes or maybe even next. But that's where lease years is an important definition that you want to make sure you're reading in your lease.
Yes, lease year is next. And it might seem like an unimportant definition, but it can affect everything from escalation dates, term, how CAM charges are calculated. Some define it based on the first day of rent, other use first full calendar month, but always confirm how lease year is defined and what it applies to. It may say lease year, but it only applies to CAM, and your rent and your term is all in months. We have some examples. Um, and then here, let's look at how these are commonly defined. They're typically pretty standard, but there can be some variations. The 12-month starting from the rent commencement date, and then the 12-month starting on the first day of the month following the rent commencement date, a calendar year, January through December, regardless of start date. There's a few different ways, but it matters, like I said, because of rent escalation, CAM recs, and renewal options often key off lease years. And if your rent commencement date is mid-month and your lease year starts on the first of the next month, you've got a gap that can lead to confusion, especially if there's a partial month of rent, if prorated charges are involved. And tying it all together is lease term. All these key dates go together. Heather, do you want to talk about lease term?
Sure. It may sound simple. It could be 10 years or 15 years, but in reality, it can be contingent on the things the lease might say. The term starts on a certain date, but elsewhere in the lease, a different date could be defined and or could be used to define the actual start date. So you want to pay attention to that language. And then always verify how the lease defines the term and when it truly begins. Um, on the next slide with the example, the terms and provisions of the lease shall become effective upon the effective date of this lease. So again, um, going back to that effective date, we know that the terms that you're bound by are as of the effective date. And then the initial term of the lease shall be for 16 years, commencing on the earlier of. So right there, you see that the effective date does not have any bearing on the term. This is just saying that's when you're bound by the lease, but the term starts on the earlier of January 1st, 2024, or the date that you open for business. So again, we kind of went over this before. You're going to pay attention what happens first because that's going to be when your term actually starts. Um, and then this also kind of refers to the date landlord has substantially completed improvements or in this case, phase one work and turns possession over to the tenant, which is referred to as the turnover date, which many of you probably are very familiar with. And obviously, there's can be delays to that, but it's occurs prior to the expiration of the permit period. So you always want to read these terms and pick it apart, dissect it, look at, like I said, the effective date is thrown in there, but it doesn't have any bearing on the actual term of the lease.
And why we're really talking about all of this is the option renewal notice dates. If we don't have any of the other dates right, or if you have some of them wrong, this could really throw this one off. We have seen tons of cases where someone thought their lease ended a certain date, but it was actually earlier or later, and they missed the renewal window because of it. Once that deadline passes, it can be really tough to get that option back, depending on your situation. If your landlord is in a really good place and they have a lot of interest in that suite, then it could be very expensive. And you also, this is a little off subject, but you also want to make sure you pay attention to the requirements for exercising that option. Many times there's a specific address or, certified mail is required. We've got some examples come up. This first one is auto renew. Um, if it might sound great to have an auto renew, you set it, you forget it, and you just keep your space. But if your expiration date is off and you do not plan on renewing, you could inadvertently exercise your option. You must give notice before 80 days in this example that you do not want to renew, otherwise you're deemed to have exercised. The next scenario, it states your options and it states you must exercise it, but it does not state by when. So typically it's reasonable notice is the default, but you may want to look into state contract law, reach out to your landlord to get an amendment so you know when you must exercise by. Typically, we say 6 months is reasonable, but it may vary by state. Um, the next scenario is slightly more complicated. There's multiple required notices and deadlines. If your calculation is even slightly off, you could lose your renewal entirely. This one has multiple steps. First, you have to send the notice saying, I might want to renew. And then the landlord proposes rent. This one I think is fair market value, maybe. Um, yes, it is. And then you find out how much, and then you have a final opportunity to actually exercise. And then there's a deadline. So no sooner than 12 months, no less than 8. So this is why it's important. If you're off, if you think your rent commencement date was the triggering date for your term, but really it was the lease commencement date, you could miss this window entirely. And you don't want to be struggling last minute to, try and engage your landlord in exercising this renewal.
Um, while we're here, I want to tell a little story um, about expiration dates and renewals. We had a customer, we helped them with their abstraction. We had their expiration date in, and they came to us later with an estoppel, and they wanted some direction on this estoppel that they sent in. And we noticed that the estoppel expiration date was different than what was originally abstracted and what was determined by calculations in the lease. And it was enough of a, I think it was like April and October. So we had October. That was what the customer believed their expiration date was. This estoppel said April, and it was kind of like a heart-dropping moment where if it is, you definitely haven't given your notice to renew, and it definitely needs clarification. This is kind of the point of knowing that you're on the same page with the landlord because of those renewal options. And when we saw that date being completely different in the estoppel, we were like, you got to go back to your landlord and figure that out before anything. So it kind of brings you back also to estoppels, just to throw that in. Always make sure when you're signing an estoppel that you are verifying that you're agreeing when you sign that that is the expiration date. Same thing with the commencement date.
Heather,
So
did you want to continue on this?
yeah, why it's important to verify critical dates. My little
Yep.
story kind of covered that, but um, you know, you could start, you want to make sure you're paying rent when you're supposed to. You're not paying rent any earlier, or that you're paying it late. There's always a late fee involved with paying late. Um, I want to say again, just reiterate, just what, even if it's an email from your landlord memorializing your dates, you always try to get that um, after you've signed your lease and things have happened, whether it's your opening or construction's done. Just getting those milestones confirmed with the landlord is going to be important for you. Um, but you don't want to miss any free rent periods. You want to make sure those are well defined in the lease as well. You may have a commencement date that happens, and that triggers early occupancy, which of course is different than free rent. Sometimes landlords give you 2 weeks of early occupancy to get your FF&E set up. So you want to make sure you are reading in your lease your commencement date and your rent commencement date. And those really do affect and have a domino effect and trickle down to other dates and obligations. Um, you might be paying percentage rent, um, and they may escalate sooner than expected. So I think we've given you a lot to think about as far as, knowing your lease, knowing your dates, and understanding your lease language. But these are some examples.
And to continue this, some things to help you here. It's sometimes hard to track this down, and it's not always in the lease. Like we have shown you, there's so many factors and so many triggering events. So it's important to obviously have your fully executed and dated lease, have all amendments and addendums. possession documents, any letters, emails you get from your landlord, keeping all your permits when they were applied for and received, construction milestones, like if the landlord has to deliver it by a certain date, and most importantly, the date you open for business is important to track because that's often a triggering date. We have some real life examples. Basically, we walked you through bits and pieces. This is just kind of tying it all together.
Um, Before we get into this example, I do want to touch really quick on acquisitions. And I can't tell you how many times we have seen leases that were assigned and, we get the lease and maybe a third amendment, no first and second. Um, or we'll see something in that references previous amendments. So those are always important to when you're acquiring to try to get those. I know sometimes it can be really hard to get some of those documents from the landlord or the original tenant, the seller, but those may have verification of original dates. A lot of times we get these assignments that come in and we know the date that you purchased or that you acquired the business and that's like your rent start date. But if you get into these schedules like the one on the screen here that has monthly installments or year one, year two, there's no way of us knowing what year you're in without those original dates. So when it comes to acquisitions, it's always good to make sure you're getting the original commencement and rent commencement dates as well. Or at least get them if in your assignment, memorialized in the assignment. That's even better that the landlord is, or that you're getting those dates agreed upon in the assignments. But for this example, so the lease shall be for a term of 15 years, unless it's ceased sooner. To commence on the date landlord delivers the premises to tenant and free of any occupants and shall expire on the last day of the month on which it commenced. Perfect. Um, and then you have your schedule underneath, which is commencing on the rent commencement date and on or before the 5th of the month when your rent is due. The rent commencement date shall be the date that's 180 days after the commencement date. So again, having to do those calculations, super important. We get the commencement date, and this is a perfect example. This is from an actual lease. So there's just unknowns. You got to get the first date to calculate 180 days from that to get your rent start date.
The next scenario, the lease year is defined in this one and it starts on the commencement date. And then you see the minimum rent is listed in lease years, but then the rent commencement date does not start and it does not align with lease years. So this could cause some confusion on when your rent escalations are. In this scenario, by the letter of the lease, your first year would only be about 6 months at that first rate, and year two would start on the commencement date, anniversary date. So you might sign this lease thinking that you've got a year at this 28,000, but if you look closer, it's actually only about 6 months. Your free rent is eaten up half of that year, and your escalations start possibly much sooner than you anticipated. And next is how to track and manage these milestones. It's so much to even think about. All those dates we just talked to you about. There's a whole series of upstream milestones before you can even begin to think about these dates. So we'll quickly, I know we've gone really long on this, walk you through each of these events and why they matter. Heather, you want to talk about these?
So lease execution date, again, it could trigger the effective date. Sometimes the effective date will say, as of the last execution date of the lease is the effective date. So again, and that may start the countdown for possession or landlord to start the work. Possession date, often tied to the lease commencement date, again, when the landlord turns over possession to you, or may even start when utilities and insurance, your triple net start. Tara, you can take the next.
Sure. The next one, landlord delivery, substantial completion. You'll want to know what that means. Is this when, the HVAC and the walls are done? Does this, have anything to do with the punch list? You'll want to know clearly what this is. So you know if the possession clock is triggered from this one. The next permit application date. Some leases require you to start by a certain deadline, and if you miss that deadline, then it could accelerate when rent is due. So this is something important to track to know when you have to have it applied for and track. So if your landlord follows up, wants to know if you did it in a timely manner. Heather, you want permit receipt?
Once you have your permit in hand, that might trigger the start of your TI period. So, and may even start the countdown to rent. So we've seen leases that say rent starts 120 days after permits are received. So this one is super important for backdating your obligations. If your city delays things and your lease doesn't give you flexibility, you'll want to prove when that permit actually came through. Start of tenant improvements. This is when your contractor actually starts the work inside to do the improvements for your space. And as you know, things can be delayed, but some leases start the rent on the clock based on when you begin your work and assume that you'll start with X number of days for getting your permit. Either way, the milestones help explain how the timeline is moving and can be a critical date if you're negotiating with delays or extensions.
This one we have talked about, and you've seen in many of those examples where it was the earlier of all those dates or store opening. So this is something obviously you would want to know and track the store opening and the certificate of occupancy. We also touched on this briefly, the rent abatements, start and end dates. There can be some ambiguity there. Full months, partial months, 180 days, or 6 months. This is something you will want to confirm with your landlord and keep it separate from that rent commencement date so you can understand what your term actually is. This last one, it's a catch-all. It's just basically this is the end of the line. If you've missed the dates, you're forced to begin your term then, even if, like Heather mentioned, there were delays out of your hands. So you'll want to look for this in your leases too. Maybe avoid having it included in your lease. And managing these dates with Leasecake. Heather, you want to talk?
Sure. Um, when you whether it's us or you're doing your own abstraction, and you're pulling all of this and you're utilizing a software like Leasecake to track these dates. Once you have those memorialized and you plug them in, you're going to get notifications. You can set yourself up tasks to remind you of these dates. So again, if it's 180 days from when the landlord delivers the premises to you or your opening of business at your rent starts, you're going to want to calculate the date landlord delivers and then gives you add your 180 days and then set yourself up a task to remind you to check that date because that's going to be your rent commencement date. You can set up custom reminders regarding your permits and get notifications on those. There's lots of different ways to track your dates, but with our software, you can actually put all of those customizations in for anything specific, even your TI allowance and making sure you're getting your receipts in on time, those kinds of things. this is how you can help track all of these critical dates.
Um, Lastly, there's some pitfalls that we often see, especially with a lot of our customers in growth mode. Um, as you move from, 1 to 2 locations up 10 plus even more, it's important that you no longer rely on memory. We have a lot of our customers who are tracking all these things in their head. And, sometimes they're relying on certain team members and email threads. And when a team member leaves, you kind of lose access. So that's one thing to definitely avoid. And secondly, don't assume all leases are the same. Even if you're using a pretty standard form during the negotiations, some key things can get changed with landlord work, rent triggers. And lastly, don't rely on one person calculating all your dates. Make sure you cross-check. It's it's helpful to loop in brokers, attorneys, project managers, everyone who knows these dates, but you should always double check and not rely on how those dates are entered. And that brings us to any questions.
All right. Thank you, ladies. We will check the Q&A for questions while I'll give you all a minute to send your questions in, and I'll just give you an update on future webinars. If any of these topics resonate with anyone, we'll be including links to them in the follow-up email we send with the recording. But we have thinking about private equity or transaction in your future with Citrin Cooperman. That is in a few weeks. Heather and Tara again will be diving into clauses in our leases. So beyond just the dates, we're going to go into the clauses that can be hiding risk and opportunity for you there. We have Jim Biddickson, the president and CEO of Dave's Hot Chicken. He's coming up on June 10th, talking about franchising, private equity, and how they have built their amazing brand. And then we've got a large franchisee of Jack in the Box, and I believe a few other multi-brand. He's a multi-brand franchisee with over 100 locations, sharing his story. So we've got some good stuff coming up, and we hope you can join us for that. And let's see, do we have any questions that have come up? I will be sending the recording and the slides separately, so don't worry about that. We'll definitely be doing that. The next question we got is the cost of the software. It is location based, and we can give you that pricing separately. I can send you an email and we can talk about that specifically, but it does depend on the number of locations in your business. But I just want to say to the two of you, this is amazing. I work in marketing, so I don't do this stuff every day, but I can't imagine the number of details that you have here. That was just times one lease. I can't imagine doing it times, like, if you're actually managing 100 or 300 or 1,000 leases, like having to keep track of that. So do you think I think what I gathered from that, the best practice is just when you sign a lease, determine all those dates in writing, get them signed off by the landlord. And then at that point, that's when they generally go into something like Leasecake, or if you're managing on a spreadsheet or whatever, however you're managing it. But that's what you think is that the best, number one trick that you would say is to
I
make
would
sure
say,
you
yeah.
it down?
It would be a great habit to get into and
Yeah.
bugging your landlord, because I mean, especially they want to be on the same page with you. Coming from working as a landlord and for a landlord, and managing properties, retail space, I'll tell you, you want to be on the same page. I'll give you another little tidbit. Landlords budget ahead of time and they forecast. So when you're going to be up for renewal, they already have it in their head, maybe some TI allowance that you may need, what they think you may renew for. Even if your renewals, 5 years in your lease, um, you want to have those dates set so that you can start talking about your renewal, because in your lease you may have renewal set in there at a, even if it's not at fair market, you may have 3% increases in there, but you may have needs that have come up between the time you sign your lease and you're renewing. You want to give yourself ample time before you're exercising your option to start talking about your needs and what you want to do with your renewal.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely best practice I've heard from pretty much every webinar guest we've ever had that has, manages properties. They always say that communication with your landlord is like the best thing you can do from day one. It's like they have this reputation of, the landlord's out to get you, but it's just like any other relationship. If you started out by being very upfront and honest about what you want and just continuing the communication throughout, that generally helps people.
Right.
So.
And I'll tell you just from my experience working for a landlord and being a property manager, the quieter the tenant, the less you think they have needs, the more you kind of think like everything's going great. We're just going to renew them per their lease, and it just happens. You just renew them and they'll sign, they're busy, they're running their business. And next thing they needed flooring, new flooring, or they needed something freshened up in their space and they didn't ask for it at the time. They could have gotten that $3 per square foot or $5 per square foot tenant allowance worked into their renewal.
Oh my, so many things to know. All right. Well, we don't have any other questions that came through, but I'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording and the slides separately. And if you would like to ask us any other questions, you can just reply to that and I can include Heather and Tara's email addresses if you want. So thank you both for sharing your expertise. That was very educational for me personally. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. Let us know if you have any other questions.